Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here. Today's video is actually a request by Commander Jeff Hallam, one of my members at Commander tier. If you want a video request, then consider becoming a member at the Commander level. You'll get an opportunity every month to request a topic for me to make a video on. Thank you so very much. Right, so as you guessed by the title, we're looking at the weird and wacky timeline of the Star Trek Mirror Universe. Now, I'll just make a caveat right off the bat that there are multiple divergent timelines, alternate realities within this alternate reality. What I'm trying to do here is just the canon timeline. I'd say canon, with parentheses there. It's a wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey. So, off we go down the rabbit hole. So the first thing I want to talk about, points of divergence between our universe, the Prime Universe, and the Mirror Universe. So one of the things that's brought up in Discovery does a lot with the Mirror Universe. They really have a thing for it. I'm not going to get psychoanalytic. But what they bring up in Discovery is that Terrans have biological differences with regular humans, and this makes sense. Biology informs behavior and temperament and all these things. So, you might say that Terrans are perhaps closer to chimpanzees than bonobos. That's the old comparison, isn't it? But, there are other things, the light level is lower in the Mirror Universe, stuff like that. The other thing is that it's said by Emperor Giorgio, may or may not be a reliable source, and, obviously looking to puff herself up, that the ideals of freedom and equality were abandoned about a millennia ago. So we're looking at around, 10th century, right? 10th century AD. That probably indicates perhaps no Christendom came about. Perhaps the Roman Empire continued in a more brutal form like under Nero, and other empires as well perhaps continued on longer in a very brutal form. Now, another caveat is that it's suggested that other species also experienced a changed timeline. So like the Vulcans never had Surak and remained very militant. That doesn't really mesh well with the timeline, because then how in the blazes would Earth conquer the Vulcans if the Vulcans are warlike? Because warlike Vulcans, they're like Romulans, but even worse. It doesn't. The Vulcans wouldn't be Vulcans, essentially, and definitely couldn't be conquered by the Terrans. I don't really like that. Again, the other one is the Klingons, instead of Kahless winning the duel, Molor wins the duel, and Klingons are like all dishonorable and, sneaky, and again, that doesn't really work. It means that the Terrans would never be able to get an upper hand. I think what makes the Mirror Universe work is everyone else is the same. And I'm not saying there aren't realities where those other species, there are probably other timelines where those other species do see those changes, and perhaps there is one where they all see those changes, but in the prime Mirror Universe, the main timeline, it wouldn't make sense if other species changed. I think it needs other species remain the same, but Terrans are just awful. Right, so then we get to the rise of the Empire. So how does the Terran Empire come about? So it seems that World War III does play out, possibly worse, and perhaps they further develop weaponry as a result, that the war goes on for longer in a more violent way, and they end up developing even more devastating weapons that mean that while they don't have warp drive, they have weapons far beyond what you'd normally expect for a pre-warp civilization, which would perhaps help them when they need to start expanding into the solar system for resources. And I'm guessing Cochrane's development of warp drive was meant to sort of expedite that process, or perhaps he suspected alien life was out there and built the Phoenix to lure them to Earth. They then obviously capture the Toplana Hath and probably start expanding very aggressively with a desperate violence in order to obtain resources, because they've messed up their own planet so much. So they quickly conquer those species that form the early Federation and actually incorporate their technology, which is interesting. This is an interesting point of divergence or difference, in that these Terran ships are probably more powerful than their 22nd century counterparts because they'll be incorporating Vulcan and Andorian technology into their ships. That's what's said by Archer. So these are, pretty powerful ships, and they're kind of ahead of their time, similar to they're more closer to from 50 years ahead in the Prime timeline. The other thing that happens, which is kind of weird, doesn't really seem to mesh with the Empire's ideology, they use alien personnel in their military, which is strangely inclusive for something that's meant to be a racial supremacist ideology. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Surely you just want these people slaving away in the mines. Now, my suspicion as to why that happens is because of necessity, essentially. Not only are the aliens on ships, but they actually hold rank. You have Vulcan officers, and I'm sure there's probably a hierarchy, but you have officers of these aliens that would be commanding presumably humans. Because they're expanding so aggressively, so quickly, and they're, losing a lot of personnel, they have to really relax criteria a lot. I mean, that's partially why, if you want to think about it, it's kind of like why promotions happened so quickly in Napoleon's French army. It was basically, you survive the battle, you get a promotion, at least at the lower ranks, because they were just seeing such a huge turnover of personnel. Again, similar thing in Second World War Germany with some of their notionally, ideologically motivated divisions. Shan't use the name because YouTube might demonetize me, but they had to relax the recruitment criteria so that, suddenly you've got, people who don't fit that ideal are being seen in those units because they just need people at this point. They don't really care about, the ideology kind of goes out the window. So, yeah, there's already cracks in the structure in that even in the early Empire, it can't really seem to live up to its its humanity first ideology. Now, the Empire, by the end of the 22nd century, does seem to cement itself. They get the tech from the Defiant, not that one, but that one. They seem to defeat the first rebellion. Empress Hoshisato seizes power, and likely this is representative of a cycle that will continue through the rest of the Empire, basically coups and seizures. Certainly it seems that way by the early 23rd century, early to mid 23rd century, which is the High Empire era. So by this point, we're looking at how it is in Discovery, and look at the Empire in Discovery. It seems to diverge very heavily from the Prime universe. They've got a lot of different technology, and look at the uniforms and all the stuff. They're really beaning it on the whole, High Empire sort of look. And it does seem, that one does seem a little bit more Terran supremacist. It doesn't seem to, aliens don't seem to be as present within Starfleet. So perhaps once that was all sorted, they actually, recommitted to their ideology. Now, during this time, we'll see Klingons attempt to instigate rebellions. There is still a Klingon empire out there, but you've also got individual Klingons who are pushing for a rebellion within the Terran Empire. And then we see in the original series, and now of course, production order, but the ships like the Enterprise are still actively expanding the Empire's borders. That's really the height of the Terran Empire, is in the early to mid 23rd century. We then start to see the decline and fall of the Empire. So what happens is that Spock, after Mirror Mirror, Spock takes control of the Enterprise and eventually becomes Emperor. Weirdly. Like I say, weird and wacky timeline. And he's kind of a Constantine figure. He starts to implement liberal reform, and conditions improve in the Empire, but they are unprepared for renewed aggression by the Klingon Empire, probably after Praxis explodes and they need to expand. So they join with the Cardassians to form the Alliance, and in the late 23rd century, probably the 2290s through to the early 24th century, the Alliance crushes the Terran Empire. It is led by a regent who appoints intendants. They seem to conquer the Terran Empire, certainly by the time it's in anyone's living memory. The inhabitants of the Terran Empire are then enslaved by the Alliance. And, it seems to really be just like, the wheel turning. Well, they had a little bit of a taste of liberal reform, but once again face a repression now just under a different power structure. So that's how really the Terran Empire falls, and it doesn't really ever seem to recover. So the inhabitants are enslaved by the Alliance. Other races join the Alliance and seem to do pretty well out of it, like the Bajorans. By the 2370s, a rebellion develops, a Terran rebellion, and it kind of mirrors the Wacky conflict very deliberately. They're hiding in the Badlands, they're using small attack ships, stuff like that. Now, eventually, this culminates in Regent Worf's capture, which is a major victory. It's not specified what happens to Regent Worf, if he gets returned, if he gets ransomed, or if they just kill him. They never spell it out. But obviously, that clearly dealt quite the blow to the Alliance. As pressure from the Terran Rebellion mounts, they also join with the Romulan Remnant and start liberating the Empire, the core worlds of the Empire. This kind of causes the Alliance to split. There seem to be internal tensions within the Alliance that begin to manifest once they start facing defeat. The Klingons would probably become very frustrated with the complacency of the stagnancy of the Cardassians. So the Alliance will split. And at this point, again, there are different options available, and what seems to be the canon is that a galactic commonwealth forms. Now, I'm not sure that would work, because I think the lesson of the Mirror Universe, or the lesson learned in the Mirror Universe, will be that democracy, freedom, equality, or stuff like that, as was implemented by Spock, lead to weakness and possibly an invasion. So I don't think they would go to a Commonwealth. Maybe some kind of new Imperial Union. So perhaps you'd have a Terran Emperor, an overarching Emperor. But underneath you'd have the individual governments of Andoria, Vulcan, Beta Z, all the individual states under the Empire. I can see that maybe happening for a renewed Empire. I doubt the Commonwealth could be particularly liberal in the Mirror Universe, because that has just been shown to abjectly fail. I'm thinking some kind of Terran Empire is rebuilt. I don't think it would be nearly as repressive and ideological and violent as it was in the 23rd century in the High Empire. But kind of maybe like a Byzantine Empire equivalent. I know I'm a bit fond of making that comparison, but Empire I think would continue. And it would be somewhat authoritarian. I don't think they're prepared for liberal democracy in that universe. So that's really my thoughts on the Mirror Universe timeline as we see it. So, like I say, it's weird and wacky. It's kind of like 40k. A lot of people seem to like it. I see a lot of stuff of people making just Terran Empire ships and things. It's very cool, and like I say, they're in some ways very different from their prime timeline contemporaries. I think the visual designers could maybe emphasize that a bit more, but the studio's cheap, so whatever. But in conclusion, I think the destiny of the Mirror Universe, I think the overall timeline is darker, obviously, and I think it would be nice for them to end up with a nice liberal democracy and freedom and all that sort of things. But I feel like they're going to have to just go for the best they can do. They say in Discovery, final point, that the Mirror Universe seems to have diverged heavily from the Prime timeline, so much so that they cannot make any crossover. So I mean, you know, it pretty heavily diverges already. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. What do you think happens in the mirror universe? Would you like more kind of breakdowns like this? And I'll see you guys in the next video.